his apartment was moving backwards and forwards about 15 to 20 inches, and you did that for 4 or 5 minutes, and at the end of it you go, I have to move.
Oh, geez. That's how good they were. I don't know. What do you think about that metal? Nails through concrete. Fairly excited. Was it the Structural Engineering Podcast?
Welcome to this season's first episode of the Structural Engineering Podcast. My name is Max.
And I'm Zach. Man, I feel like we haven't done an intro in forever.
Yeah. So we're kicking off this season with a fun talk with Dynamic Isolation Systems. They make
base isolation systems.
I guess their name really said most of it. We talk with Konrad and Mohammed, Director of Engineering and President over there, about some of their cool projects, how to implement the system, what they're working on now. So cover a lot.
Now, Max, before we jump into our conversation with them, let's dive into a little news and back to our tips.
Oh, yeah. What do you got?
So, it's nothing we ever really want to discuss or bring up, but it's something we can learn the most from, which is failures. And the most recent one that has occurred really is in Puerto Rico. They had a magnitude 5.0 earthquake or 5.5 earthquake initially, and they've had a bunch of aftershocks.
I know they had some sixes, right? I thought they had a 6.5 and a 6.
You might be right. Pretty substantial earthquakes. So have you seen some pictures, some articles, anything like that from the Puerto Rico earthquake?
I haven't really, no.
Okay, so they've been quite devastated, I should say. At least from the news reports and everything. And the big thing I really wanted to bring up with this is structurally, what can we learn from it? And what were the, so far, the kind of the preliminary things that have been seen that are failures, and how can we look out for these in seismic regions, and just kind of giving a little understanding of how they used to build things back in the day and why those don't necessarily work very well in earthquakes. So the two big failures they saw were unreinforced masonry, which we know very well, and the other one was non-ductile concrete moment frames. And the interesting thing is these were both kind of the issues they saw down in South America with some recent earthquakes, as well as the Mexico City earthquakes. So it was definitely a building construction type that used to be used a lot more, and we've started learning from past failures that, ductility is pretty important.
I'd say so. Yeah, I just flipped to a page looking at how many earthquakes and what magnitude Puerto Rico's had. I don't know when this was updated, but at the time, since the very end of December, they've had over 300 magnitude 3 earthquakes. So remember that 3 is pretty much the start of what you can feel. They've had 10 over a 5, including the one 6.4 and 5.9. That's absolutely wild.
Something I thought was, I don't know, it bothered me as a structural engineer was just seeing the families on this out in their yard camping because they were too scared to go back in their house because they didn't feel safe that their house wouldn't collapse if a big aftershock hit. And that I don't know, as structural engineers, that kind of hit home, it was like, we're there preventing people from having to sleep in their out in their yard, and people that are actually scared to go in their homes that is where they feel most comfortable.
Yep. Well, do your job right. No pressure.
Max, now a little news. It's a little good insight on some failures with seismic loading. What kind of tips do you got for us this week?
I think we could put something together. This is we both happened to see a webinar a week or two ago that was really good, and it was on serviceability. And one of the things that stuck with me was looking at serviceability of wind events. Right. So if you're looking at a structure, there's not really good code guidance on the deflection limits under wind. For whole building deflection. There's tons of them for seismic. But when we're looking at wind, we definitely don't want to use our ultimate load to figure out what our maximum deflection is. What we really want to use is something closer to the 10-year or 50-year mean occurrence interval. So since ASC 710, we jumped to a 700-year MRI. In ASC 705, we were down at the 50, and that's why we saw our winds jump. So if we were using those to calculate our maximum deflection, we'd be super conservative, right? So in the back of ASE 716, we've got a bunch of cool maps. What years were you broken down to?
Yeah, so the maps are located in Appendix C, and actually the commentary of Appendix C for serviceability. And there's a 10-year, 25-year, 50, and 100-year occurrence interval.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so there's a little trick to get you down to the 10-year, which is a pretty flexible number to use on more sensitive structures. Maybe if you have a pedestrian bridge or something. This is something I was just looking at where a 50-year felt like it might be more appropriate. But if you are looking at a typical building, you'd want to use something closer to a 10-year MRI for your serviceability checks. So you take your ultimate load, and to bring it down to that 50-year, you multiply it by 0.6. That is kind of the difference we had from our old code to our new code. And then to bring it down to the 10-year, we multiply that again by 0.7. So sometimes you might see 0.42 to get you to a serviceability check. That's bringing you from an ultimate level load to a 10-year MRI, and you check your serviceability against that. If you want to be a little more stringent, I don't know what you multiply by, but you go to the map on the back and you look at what your wind speed is at 50-year. So you're also not multiplying the wind speed, keep in mind, you're multiplying the pressure. Since the pressure is proportional to the square of the speed, it's not exactly linear. So I think, leave anything hanging there?
Yeah, so what are we limiting those to?
Oh, I did leave something.
They also have a suggestion in the back there about lateral deflections. And again, it's kind of up to the engineer to determine this, but they discuss and definitely go to it is ASC 716 Appendix C commentary 2.2 that talks about drift of walls and frames. But they say commonly they use an L over 600 or L over 400 as a general limit for your deflection criteria.
Yeah, and that's pretty darn stiff, right? H over 600 is the same thing we'd use for a masonry wall. So I think a lot of people are using less than that. I've heard, I think in the webinar that we saw, the presenter used H over 400 for each story and H over 500 for the total structure. That's kind of what I shoot for. Nice.
Great tip, Max.
Thank you. All right. Well, let's talk to DIS.
Well, I'm Konrad Eriksson. I'm president of the company. I've been with the company since 1992. Later in 2006, I became president of the company, and currently I am more responsible for doing sales, marketing, and general management of the company and business development type of activities. So that's kind of a snapshot of me.
I'm Mohammed. I'm the director of engineering. I've been here since 2016. I finished my bachelor's and master's in Egypt, and then I got my PhD from the University of Nevada, Reno.
Thank you. First one we always like to ask when it's something that's a little bit complicated is how would you describe this to a non-engineer? Like at the bare bones, what is base isolation? Okay.
Usually I will tell people that it's like having suspension for your structure. So what that does, it decouples it from the ground. We provide some softness. So the rubber and the lead rubber bearing acts like a spring for the structure. And then the lead core in the center acts like a damper. So it's like a suspension system, except it's working in the horizontal direction as opposed to, say, the vertical direction, as may be the case on your vehicle. Maybe I could also add to that by doing so, we see a lot less force get into the structure, and then whatever force gets into the structure, we can damp out so that it doesn't damage it.
Right. So I guess a little backstory of how we found you guys. We had recorded an episode with Ron Mays with the U.S. Resiliency Council, and we're talking about seismic resiliency in cities, and we said, okay, Ron, what's the best way to do this? And he talked about some ways to mitigate. The key is floor accelerations, and really the true way to make your structure resilient is base isolation. Why does a base isolation system create a true resilient structure?
Basically, because after an earthquake, there will be no damage into the structure. So it's you are isolating the building from the ground. You are isolating the building from the ground motion. It's very similar. Like just imagine that someone is standing on a skateboard, and then when an earthquake comes, he just slides back and forth. So he cannot feel the earthquake itself. So there is no damage after the earthquake. You're isolating the building totally from the ground.
And then further to that, you're reducing the accelerations felt by the building by about a factor of 3 to 4. So you've got 3 to 4 times less acceleration on the building. And at that point, it's easy to design it to stay largely elastic.
When you said, so you moved the manufacturing to the U.S., I feel like when I think of base isolation, I don't really think of the U.S. I think Japan. What kind of structures in the U.S. are using base isolation systems currently?
Typically, a lot of hospitals, data centers. In recent times, we haven't seen a lot of isolation in buildings. However, we're seeing quite a lot of activity in the bridge side of things. And there's some differences to be noted there that are really code related. So when we isolate a building, we can't really take advantage of the performance that isolation is giving us. So we add a little bit of cost, but we get a much better performing building. When we do a bridge, we reduce the forces in the foundations, and we have to design those to stay elastic. So we actually save money by having lower forces designed to. So in the bridge market, it's a very easy sale. It's if you use isolation, you'll get better performance, and it'll be at lower cost. So that's a pretty easy sale even for us to make.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you mentioned structures and bridges. What industries and regions are going kind of the quickest to adopt this technology? I know it's been around for a while. It seems like the U.S. is getting into it more and more.
All the countries with frequent earthquakes, they adopt this quickly, like South America. Chile, for example, they have a big earthquake every 1 or 2 years. So they started to look into solutions. They had a problem, so they started to look into solutions. Here in the U.S., the last big earthquake was Northridge, 1994. So they don't have a problem right now to find a solution for. So many countries like New Zealand, Peru, Chile, they have frequent earthquakes, so they adopt this technology very quickly.
And the other thing with the US is in the US, we're also much more comfortable with risk. So if you compare the US to Japan, I think most US people can cope with some risk. They have a shorter memory. Yeah. Shorter memory in a good way. So, and I'll use an example here in Reno. We had a flood in 1996 that put one quarter of the city underwater. And The next summer, I spoke to our landlord because we had a barbecue for, Good Tenants Appreciation Day. And I said, do you have trouble leasing those buildings that got flooded? And they had 5 feet of water in a lot of them. And she said, no, it's summer. I said, there's still a line on the wall. She goes, yeah, but it's summer. So,
my goodness.
If you go to Japan, it's quite the opposite. And in Japan, from a cultural perspective, the general public's looking to their engineers to provide good performing structures for them, and they're happy to pay for it.
Yeah.
So the first condominium building we did in Japan, I spoke to the developer. I said, what made you isolate this? And he said, everybody's happy to pay 10 to 15% premium to buy a better performing condominium. And then he said, I sold every single one on a Saturday morning when I opened my showroom on site. He said, I sold every one. And so great commercial option. In the US, if we ask people what they like in their apartment or house right now, I'm sure you're going to get a much better kitchen before you put some isolation in. I think that's changing because people, with the information availability now, I think people are becoming more aware of earthquakes. But if you don't have one and feel it, it's a little bit hard to put that up in your list of priorities as something that you would spend money on.
Yeah. Zach and I were actually just talking about this before the episode, and it felt like to me people don't look at buildings as technology. If you took the same approach that people take on their buildings, we'd all be driving like 1990 Honda Accords. It just keeps working. It fits 4 people. Like, why would you need anything else, right? But people are happy to spend on everything else, and somehow there's a lack.
Yeah, that could be civil engineers haven't done a good job, with our pickiness.
Well, I like the risk thing that you said, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I've not heard that as an example for why Americans don't. I've always wondered why these technologies have been more readily adopted elsewhere. And the US is just so hesitant to have higher performing structures. And maybe us as civil and structural engineers don't sell that very well. But anyone that's been in an earthquake, I feel like should just have that ingrained.
Yeah, well, my rep in Chile, he gave us a really good example of what it feels like. So he used to live in a 8-story apartment building. So he said if you get one of the major earthquakes, which several years ago they were having these about every 3 or 4 months, he said basically he'd get thrown on the floor and it felt like his apartment was moving backwards and forwards about 15 to 20 inches. And you did that for 4 or 5 minutes, and at the end of it, you go, I have to move. So he built a single-story house, and at that time, we isolated a lot of condominium buildings because people were, when you go through that, people get so freaked out. They're like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yes.
I'm fearing for my life through the 4 or 5 minutes. So pretty good sales pitch, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes, and there is a big difference in the public awareness, say, between the US and Japan. And the media also has a big effect on this. So the isolation is in the media in Japan. And everyone knows the public knows about isolation. There's a difference in awareness.
I think we can do better to provide awareness in the US.
We need an earthquake, unfortunately.
Yeah, kick it off, just enough.
Yeah. Unfortunately, an earthquake is what will change that significantly. But I think there's it is changing. It's just a slow process because when you do it by people becoming more informed, etc., that just takes a little bit longer. Whereas if you do it by experience, it's pretty instant. So that's the big thing there.
Yeah. I heard a stat, and I think this is from our talk with Ron Mays, and he said after the Northridge earthquake, the rate of earthquake insurance went up, skyrocketed, 80% or something like this.
Sure.
And then within a couple years, it was down to 7%, something very low. And it's just like everyone just forgot.
Yeah, well, we saw that in New Zealand, actually. So after the 2011 Christchurch earthquake, there was a lot of activity. Usually you have a 1-year lag as people figure out what to do. Mm-hmm. Then you have a 2 to 3 years of response. And then after about 4 or 5 years, everyone's forgotten. So by 2016 or 15, we were being told that the importance of better earthquake engineering and protection was no longer at the forefront of everyone's thinking. Then they had an earthquake, and it's given us another 5 years of that, and it's probably going to last for longer this time because Wellington they've had about 80 buildings that need to be demolished, and they've got all sorts of problems inherent with precast flooring. So I think now the whole country's got to the point where we had a wake-up call, almost went back to sleep, and then had another one, and now it's ingrained. And if you talk to, I've got relatives, and they are so up to speed with, the earthquake performance of their building. I'll get my sister send me pictures of cracks after earthquakes, and they'll think I'm like, whatever the engineer says, listen to him, and it's okay, it's good. If it's not okay, it's no good. And she asked about liquefaction. She goes, what will happen? I go, well, you're going to have to jump 3 feet out of your building when you leave it because you're down by the waterfront and probably have no sense. But it's interesting. It's a lot of fun, actually, because it's exactly what you're saying. And because we deal with these different markets, you really get a direct feel for what people's thought processes are, and it's kind of off the wall in a way.
Yeah, I like so you guys have some involvement in the USRC, and I really like the stuff that they're doing there, trying to bring this to the forefront. I in a class in grad school a while ago, we were talking about bridge repair, and we thought it would be an interesting experiment to have a big sign before you go over to bridge and give the probability that this bridge will collapse in the future, and maybe have the same thing for buildings, like in an earthquake, right at the front door. This is the chance that this will fall down.
New Zealand has that. Mohammed and I went to a restaurant one of our trips. I think you were with me, and the restaurant had a big yellow sticker. In an earthquake, you're likely to be seriously injured if you're inside this building. Wow. Like, we should be good for lunch. We're only here for 1 hour.
Yeah. Oh man, yeah, that's what it needs to be everywhere. I think.
Yeah.
I don't know how to bring it to people's face.
Yeah, Romania has that. They have tags on a lot of their buildings, and a lot of the buildings end up being abandoned because people don't want to rent them and they don't want to live in them. So, and over time they'll be retrofitted.
Yeah, something that Ron was telling us, in New Zealand is that most people were quite surprised on the performance of the buildings. I believe he was saying only one or two collapsed due to some issues, but most of the community was surprised that after a big event they couldn't get back into their buildings, and so that's kind of started the conversation of resiliency in the community, and it sounds like they're kind of on the forefront, but maybe they're coming back now.
Yeah, they definitely are. They've taken it pretty seriously, and there's some things within government that are unique. So if you're a government manager, you can be held personally responsible for the stuff under your purvey that doesn't do well. So there's motivation for these managers to look at their buildings and go, is all my building stock up to scratch? So there's quite a few mechanisms that I think are good, but they're a little tough because all of a sudden, you're an owner, you need to spend a lot of money. Same goes in the US to get things up to current code. Mm-hmm. The other interesting thing in New Zealand, and I think it's a good case study, is that there's 3 levels of building performance, if you like. There's 1/3 code, 2/3 code, and current code. And if you're below 1/3 code, if you're a tenant, you are not obliged to occupy the building. So you can walk away from your lease. And if you're less than 2/3 of code, you can't borrow money on your building. Or get insurance very easily. So there's a big motivation to get to these 1/3, 2/3 levels because it affects your financing and insurance capability.
Yeah.
And at the 1/3 level, it affects your ability to be able to lease it or use it.
So kind of going back to the cost of things a little bit, what's the cost benefit curve of using a base isolation system for a building?
For bridges, so we are reducing the cost from the very beginning. But for buildings, you're adding some upfront in the beginning on the cost, like from 0 to 5% of the price of the building. But we have to take a look into the long term. So your building after an earthquake will not be damaged. So we have to account for the retrofit cost also. So for short term, it's more expensive by 0 to 5%, for about 5%. Mm-hmm. For a long term, it will be the overall cost will be much less because the other buildings you will need to do some repair or do something to them.
Yeah. When you're sort of selling the system, are you giving owners almost odds of an event and, what your repair costs would look like? Would you say that in this region, in 50 years, you have this likelihood of seeing an event? You build this building twice, it costs this. You add 5% now, no problem.
We really haven't done that because what you just said doesn't make sense to anybody, an engineer. So the better analogy is hey, think of it as a car, right? Your PPE is you got to go put new fenders and bumpers on it, and your MCE is you went into the crumple zone, you hop out of the car, but you're buying a new one. Yeah. And then people get it and they just go, okay, big earthquake, little earthquake, normal building, I got to, do some repairs. Big earthquake, I buy a new one.
And for developers, they don't care about this because they will sell the building anyway in a year.
I know. That's huge because there are so many new buildings, especially in the where I am, Salt Lake area. It's so many developer buildings, and they are just getting rid of them. And what do you know? What's the point?
And the sad part is that we own them through our 401ks.
Okay, so I've never done base isolated building. Max hasn't done one. Most of our audience probably hasn't. ASC 7, I believe it's chapter 17, kind of goes over base isolation. Is this what's the process at DIS? And can I call you guys and say, hey, I'm looking to do this. Can you help me? Can you kind of hold my hand through the process?
Yes, we help all of the engineers from the very beginning until they finish and put the specs and do everything. They will give us the loads, the weight of the building, the locations of the columns, and we will do some analysis, some iterations with the engineer until they finish the whole design.
Okay, so it's not like someone's just specifying, here's the isolator I'm looking for, and they just buy it from you guys. You guys are involved through the whole process.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and often there's a lot of questions from owners and people reviewing the permitting process and that. So we have to give a lot of help so that all parties get comfortable with the technology. We satisfy all the questions that they normally ask. So we're very involved and support our product and also the engineers' work.
Seems, flipping through chapter 17 of ASC 7, it can be a little intimidating. Would you say, would any structural engineer that's kind of kept up to date be able to incorporate this system? Does it take, advanced software, or once you're kind of into the RAM or ETABS, you're fine?
No, once they go into ETABS, they're fine. And even it could be easier than a regular building, because now it's like a single degree of freedom. It's much easier.
Huh. Oh, I guess that makes sense. I know that you can do a design with equivalent lateral force procedures, and if it's a single degree of freedom, that's what you're designing for. So that makes sense. Okay, so now we're going to get into the into the design questions a little bit. So this is where it's going to be very clear. Zach and I do not know, have not done this system. So hopefully none of these are too dumb, but that's why we do the podcast to ask the dumb questions now. All right, the first one I have for you. It's our understanding that wind deflection at the base level must meet similar limits as the upper story of the structure. So where you have your joint, let's say you're isolated in the basement, and your first floor where you walk in is, your isolated level. Does this limit base isolation use in areas of lower seismicity and like very high wind? If you're, let's say Utah may be a good example where you can be up in the mountains with fairly high wind, but still have a reasonable seismicity.
We can use isolation also here, because the isolation system is like we have two slopes or two stiffnesses. An initial high stiffness for all these service loads like wind loads, and then when an earthquake comes, the whole system will initiate and starts to move. So the isolation system resists the wind or the service loads first, and then moves with an earthquake. So we have a service stiffness in the beginning.
I've occasionally brought up base isolation on projects because I'm idealistic and think it'd be fun to use these things all the time. And the complaint I always hear is, oh, well, we got to do a basement, and basements are expensive, and that's not part of what we were thinking, so we can't even consider it. Are these systems often put on top of, say you had underground parking, can you place it on top of that? Or on the other side, if you aren't going underground, could you do a podium structure, which is very common, of course, and then isolate what's above? Is that beneficial at all, or is that just dumb?
Yes, we have done this before.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very common to isolate at the top of a column in a parking basement.
Yeah.
And then podium structures, yes, we've done those. And so some people don't prefer that. The other thing we've done a few times is we've had basically a tidy slab with pedestals at the isolated locations. They might be on strip footings or on piles, and just have a really small crawl space in there that's just the height of the bearing. And that's been somewhat economical because you're not trying to build a whole additional basement per se.
Okay.
Max, actually, the first time I heard about this idea of base isolation was in college. And the way I found out is the Seattle Seahawks football stadium in Seattle, the roof is isolated from the rest of the structure. There's these big bearings and stuff in there that are, I think MKA out of Seattle designed that. And yeah, it seems pretty crazy what you can do with these elements.
Nice.
Yeah, we're doing it. What are we doing up in
we're doing now, we are isolating now the roof for the Seattle arena.
Oh yeah, I saw where they're jacking the whole building up right now.
Yeah, we're working on this right now. We are manufacturing the bearings now. Yeah.
That's awesome. Phenomenal.
So, those cases, you really want to look at the isolators as being a tool for the engineer to design where forces go.
Yeah.
So you can separate the two and have an element with a stiffness you desire. You can dictate how much force goes from one part of the structure to the other, and also adjust the behavior of, say, the roof structure by adjusting the period of the whole system.
Cool.
Yeah, it seems like it's used a lot in kind of retrofitting elements, a lot of base isolation. I think, Max, you're saying there's the Utah State Capitol is base isolated. Damping, I've seen some pretty large existing structures using some sort of damping system. So it's pretty cool. For your guys' system, with large overturning moments, and do the LRBs have a large tensile capacity? And if so, what's the mechanism that allows the tensile capacity to go through your isolator?
So usually when we design the isolation system, we try as much as we can to minimize the tension on the isolators, because the tensile capacity is much lower than the compression capacity. But if we have tension, we have solutions for this. We have some specific details that we can put under the isolator so that it can move up and down, and to have some uplift capacity and tension capacity.
Yeah, and the isolator also has a nominal. We use a nominal 50 psi average stress and tension, and that's our default. But we've in design used up to 200 psi in tension and tested to demonstrate that works. So you have a nominal capacity, and then there's quite a bit of reserve that sometimes we've had to look at using if we need a force, tensile force for the system to work. Often tension is a compatibility issue. So we just had a project we looked at recently in New Zealand where it's an apartment building that's got a reasonably high aspect ratio. So there's some uplift in the columns. So we've got a detail that will let those columns lift up 40 millimeters without imparting tension into the bearing. So it's really down to what the design is demanding.
Are you guys doing all this testing in-house?
Typically we test in-house, though when we've exceeded what our testing can do, we'll often test at UC San Diego, UNR for shake table testing. We've done testing at Berkeley, but the test rig at San Diego is really good and has great capabilities. So we've done lots of testing over the years there, a lot of ultimate testing. We've tested bearings to 1.2 meter displacements with tension on them. A lot of tests to failure. So it depends on the client. The ones we did to failure were for a dam structure in Canada, and they're looking at being operational after MCE and being able to operate a lot of the key components of a dam. So when you have an MCE event on a dam, they assume they're going to demolish the dam, but before they get to that point, they've got to get the water out in a controlled manner so they don't fail it. So they are post-operational after MCE, so they really look at what the performance of all the components are at at their ultimate capacities.
For the length of life of an LRB, what is the reliability or service life, maximum number of cycles? Is there a cap to the lifespan of these at all?
They're designed for 50-year life, and one good example is in Salt Lake City in the Town and County building. Mm-hmm. So they've been installed since the late 1980s. So you're going on 40 years of in-service time frame. Mm-hmm. And those bearings have been stored in the basement under load in a frame and tested every 5 to 10 years. And pretty much less than 10% change after 40 or so years. And the biggest problem you have with buildings is that the earthquake that they designed that building for is now about 3 times bigger. So the bearings are really not the problem. It's the ground motions that we now understand. And that's true of all buildings, not the isolated ones only. It's also the conventional ones. They're also got about 3 times the demand on them.
Wow. Jeez. How do you test in situ a bearing?
Those bearings were in load frames with the same load conditions as ones that are under the building. So we'd take them out of the load frame, test them, and put them back in the load frame and put them back in the basement.
Wow.
Don't try this at home.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, sounds really difficult. Could you tell us about isolating the 320,000 square foot Utah State Capitol building?
Yeah, we supplied those isolators in the mid 2000, from about 2004 to 5. And our job was relatively straightforward because we build the bearing and test it. The job for the contractor is not so straightforward. So they ended up excavating a basement underneath. Obviously, you have to shore and support every location on that building where you do the work. The dome was really fascinating. It's 4 really large columns that come down from the dome, and they ended up having pre-stressed beams that I didn't know the dimensions, but they seemed about 12 feet tall by about 15 feet wide.
Wow.
And they had about 10 isolators under each one, a lot of pre-stressing, real major kind of work. And the interesting thing there was if you've got 10 isolators under a really rigid body like that, you've got to get the load the same in them. So one of the things they did was they did a transfusion jacking on the isolators. So flat jack on top, which can preload the bearing. And you're not just preloading the bearing, you're preloading the soil. So the soil, before you start your jacking, hasn't seen any load for a while. So on that building, they would jack all 10 bearings and monitor the load, and then they would adjust the load as the bearings and the soil settled a little bit. And then they'd also adjust the load to what it was calculated to be, or until such time the building's moving up a little bit, which means you're starting to lift it, right? And you basically put a dial gauge on, and once I think that's about 10 thou of an inch. So if you move 10 thou, don't jack anymore because you've got the load, right?
Wow.
Once the loads are stable and staying the same, then they transfuse the water out in the jacks and replace that with epoxy, which cures and sets, so you have a permanent load-carrying element that is not going to degrade, or should say the jack spring a leak, you're not going to have your building go down over time. So pretty major civil engineering kind of work there.
Oh man, how frequently are isolators put into retrofit projects versus new construction?
Pretty often. If you have historic buildings, it really makes sense.
Yeah.
And so things like Utah State Capitol, San Francisco City Hall, Oakland City Hall, those buildings have a lot of value to the communities. They are truly historic, so that makes sense. But they're expensive projects. You're generally looking in the $100 million range in 20-year-old money, because there's not been a lot done recently. We've also done projects with real high-value content. So years ago, we did a building for Hughes that was a research facilities, and that had regular, there's a moment frame reinforced concrete. So the contractor cut the columns and inserted the bearing into the columns, and that was somewhat easier because you're replacing you've got a load path that matches the bearing already. On a masonry or unreinforced masonry type building, you don't have that. You've got basically strip loading. So you've got to take your strip loading from a wall, bring it to a point, and then spread it back out. So that's where a lot of expense comes in. Another job we did in Newport Beach was for a Rockwell wafer chip factory back in the 90s. And they had a fire in the building, and it cost them $2 million a day in lost production. So they figured if they have an earthquake, they're going to lose production for 3 months. So I think it was either $17 or $30 million retrofit to isolate it made a lot of sense, so that they wouldn't lose future production. And unfortunately, they made computer chips for faxes. So I think maybe here before an earthquake came along.
Yeah, they have a bigger problem.
Yeah.
Hopefully they've developed some new technology.
Yeah. We'd hope that they're making chips for phones or something now.
Yeah.
Is there a maximum axial capacity of these? If you would you say, we can't do a building over 15 stories, most likely because, well, overturning maybe, but also is there a point where you just can't take any more axial load?
We have done several projects that we put under the same columns several isolators, like combined to each other, like 6 or 4.
Wow.
Yep. And the biggest single bearings that we've done were on a 30-story apartment building in Chile, and they had 4,400 tons of load on them. We didn't realize we had a sustained compression test, so I spent $112,000 building a frame to put them in so that we could squash them for a day. So we
Oh,
do
man.
a lot of interesting stuff, but 4,400 tons is a lot of load.
That's all the like isolator questions we have. Zach, did you have any that like came to mind while we were going?
I think I was asking them as we were going there.
Yeah. It is such a cool system. I really want to see it be used more in the US, and really I want to use it. So maybe that's a bit selfish of me.
That would be great. We'd love to help you do that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, excellent. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This is really informative. These systems are amazing. And yeah, I think I learned a lot.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the opportunity for us to talk to you. I'd love to share what we do. It's pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.